based on The Wizard and the Hopping Pot by J.K. Rowling. The Wizard and the Hopping Pot, a confession. I inherited my father's cottage on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays being dull, predictable, the sort of day when one buries the past and gets on with things. The village folk lined the lane as they carried him out, weeping into their aprons and kerchiefs as though they'd lost some saint. I suppose to them he had been one, always brewing their headache draughts and fixing their squeaking gates with a flick of his wand. I stood at the threshold, dry-eyed, impatient for the procession to finish so I could finally be alone with my magic and my ambitions. Father left me everything: the cottage, his moth-eaten robes, his collection of dented copper pots. Among them sat one particularly thick cauldron with a note tucked inside, written in his careful hand. I barely glanced at it. Something about following in his footsteps, a worn slipper resting beside the pot as punctuation to the sentiment. I tossed both into the corner. Sentimentality, I'd learned, was the luxury of those with time to waste. The knocking started that very night. A widow from 3 cottages down, her knuckles timid against my door. Through the window, I could see her twisted foot, the way it dragged behind her like a question mark. She called my father's name, then mine when she remembered. I stayed silent behind the latch until she gave up and limped away, her footprints dark in the evening mud. I returned to my supper feeling rather pleased with myself. My father had squandered his gifts on these people, these non-magical neighbors who contributed nothing but need. I had plans, real plans, for spells that would matter, enchantments that would be written about, not wasted on corns and colic. Then the pot began to hop. The sound woke me past midnight. A metallic clang, rhythmic and wrong. I lit my candle and found the cauldron in the center of the room, a brass foot jutting from its belly, gnarled and twisted just like the widow's. It lurched across the floorboards, hop, scrape, hop, leaving scratches in its wake. The noise was unbearable, echoing off the low ceiling, burrowing into my skull. I tried everything. Silencing charms slid off its surface like water off wax. Binding spells snapped the moment I turned my back. The pot simply hopped and scraped, tireless as guilt. By dawn, my head throbbed and my eyes burned. I could still hear that rhythmic clanging, even when I pressed my palms over my ears. The next day brought more knocking. A farmer whose cow had stopped giving milk, his face creased with worry. I told him I wasn't in the healing business and shut the door perhaps harder than necessary. That night, the pot sprouted udders, swollen and weeping, spattering my clean floor with sour milk. The brass foot kept up its percussion. The smell alone would have driven out a weaker man. I won't catalogue every supplicant who came, every affliction the pot collected like some demented missionary. There was the child with the hacking cough. The pot wheezed and rattled phlegm until I thought I'd go mad. The baker's rash of boils. Pustules erupted across the pot's copper hide, weeping yellow filth. An elder's dog had gone missing. The pot howled through 3 sleepless nights, a sound that scraped the inside of my ribs raw. My cottage became a museum of suffering, each edition more grotesque than the last. The pot hopped from room to room, its growing collection of miseries clanking, oozing, stinking, wailing. I couldn't eat for the stench, couldn't sleep for the noise, couldn't think for the chaos of it. I tried to destroy the thing. Blasting hexes left it unmarred. I hauled it 3 miles into the forest and buried it beneath an oak. By evening, it sat in my kitchen, covered in fresh earth, resuming its terrible dance. I even attempted to sell it at the market, but the moment a buyer approached, the pot would erupt in such a cacophony that they'd flee, crossing themselves. The village began to avoid my lane entirely. Children darted past with their fingers in their ears. The widow, her foot still dragging, crossed to the far side of the road when she saw my cottage. I was alone with my ambitions and my accursed inheritance, discovering that isolation I'd craved felt remarkably like a tomb. It was the coughing child who broke me. Not broke my will precisely, but cracked something harder, the shell of certainty I'd built around my contempt. I'd heard her pass by my cottage every morning on her way to fetch water, that wet, tearing cough echoing up the lane. One dawn I looked through my window and saw her doubled over by the well, shoulders shaking with the effort of drawing breath. She couldn't have been more than 7. The pot chose that moment to loose its own rattling cough, a sound like death itself, and I felt something shift beneath my ribs. Shame, perhaps, or exhaustion, or the terrible recognition that this child's suffering and the pot's suffering were the same suffering, and I had caused both through nothing more than refusal. I found myself at my father's old workbench before I decided to move. My hands, seemingly of their own accord, reached for the herbs I'd learned but never bothered to use: coltsfoot for the lungs, horehound for the cough, a measure of honey to sweeten it. The motions came back easily. My father had been a thorough teacher, even if I'd been a resentful student. The child's mother wept when I appeared at her door with the bottle. I told her to give the girl 3 spoonfuls at sunrise and sunset, then fled before she could thank me. That night, for the first time in weeks, the pot's coughing quieted to a wheeze, then stopped entirely. The silence felt like absolution I hadn't earned, but I had tasted it now, that silence, and wanted more. I sought out the farmer with the ailing cow. I remembered my father's remedy, blessed thistle and a warming charm, sung not spoken, the notes coaxing the milk back. It took 3 tries before I got the melody right, my voice rusty from disuse. But when the cow's udders filled and the farmer's face cracked into a smile, the pot's udders shriveled and vanished, taking the sour stench with them. One by one I hunted down the afflictions I'd refused. I found remedies for rashes and heartbreak and nightmares. I located the elder's missing dog, cowering in a ditch. A simple tracking spell I could have cast weeks ago. Each healing peeled away a layer of the pot's grotesqueries. Each neighbor I helped returned to my lane without crossing the road. The work exhausted me in ways my previous studies never had, demanding not just magical skill, but attention, imagination, the ability to see suffering I trained myself to ignore. The pot grew quieter, cleaner, lighter. Its hops became less frantic, more purposeful, as though it were learning to walk rather than flee. I began to understand it not as curse, but as conscience, my father's final and finest enchantment. He'd known exactly what I was, what I would become without intervention, and he'd left me an inheritance that wouldn't let me forget. The last affliction to leave was the twisted brass foot, the widow's foot, the first suffering I'd refused. I brewed her remedy on a night when spring rain drummed the roof, grinding the herbs myself, speaking the straightening charm my father had taught me when I was small enough to believe magic was meant for helping. When she drank it at dawn, standing in my doorway, with the pot silent behind me, her foot uncurled like a fern in sunlight. She walked away without limping, and the pot's brass appendage faded like morning mist. It sat before me now, just a pot, thick and battered, reflecting candlelight across its copper belly. I picked up my father's old slipper from the corner where I'd tossed it and placed it inside the cauldron, finally understanding. Not a relic or a metaphor, but a pattern to follow, a path to walk. The pot would never truly be still. There would always be someone suffering, always another knock at the door. But that restlessness was the point. Compassion wasn't a destination, but a practice, unglamorous and endless as breathing. I think my father knew I'd resent the lesson even as I learned it, that I'd curse him and the pot and the neighbors who needed both. But he also knew that the deepest magic isn't worked through wands or words. It's worked through witness, through the slow labor of seeing another's pain and choosing again and again not to turn away. The pot sits in the corner of my workshop now, where I can always see it. Some mornings I catch myself talking to it while I grind feverfew or steep willow bark. The village children no longer run past my cottage. The widow brings me bread. The lane outside my door stays muddy from traffic I once would have despised and now find I depend on. This is the inheritance I didn't want and cannot refuse. The knowledge that magic without mercy is just clever cruelty, that power is only worth the use you make of it, that the highest enchantment is to care for another when it costs you something. My father left me a fortune after all. I was simply too proud to recognize its value. The pot hasn't hopped in months, but I keep my herbs stocked, my door unlatched, my ear tuned for knocking. Because the silence isn't empty. It's full of the particular peace that comes from pain acknowledged and answered. And if that's not magic, then I don't know what magic is for.